The Narrative of Mr. James Rigby by Arthur Morrison. Arthur Morrison was born in 1863. He's an English author and journalist. He wrote detective stories, among other things. He died in 1945. The Narrative of Mr. James Rigby 1. I shall here set down in language as simple and straightforward as I can command the events which followed my recent return to England, and I shall leave it to others to judge whether or not my conduct has been characterized by foolish fear and ill-considered credulity. At the same time, I have my own opinion as to what would have been the behavior of any other man of average intelligence and courage in the same circumstances, more especially a man of my exceptional upbringing and retired habits. I was born in Australia, and I have lived there all my life till quite recently, save for a single trip to Europe as a boy in company with my father and mother. It was then that I lost my father. I was less than 9 years old at the time, but my memory of the events of that European trip is singularly vivid. My father had emigrated to Australia at the time of his marriage, and had become a rich man by singularly fortunate speculations in land in and about Sydney. As a family, we were most uncommonly self-centered and isolated. From my parents, I never heard a word as to their relatives in England. Indeed, to this day, I do not as much as know what was the Christian name of my grandfather. I have often supposed that some serious family quarrel or great misfortune must have preceded or accompanied my father's marriage. Be that as it may, I was never able to learn anything of my relatives, either on my mother's or my father's side. Both parents, however, were educated people, and indeed I fancy that their habit of seclusion must first have arisen from this circumstance. Since the colonists about them in the early days, excellent people as they were not as a class distinguished for extreme intellectual culture. My father had his library stocked from England and added to by fresh arrivals from time to time, and among his books he would pass most of his days taking, however, now and again an excursion with a gun in search of some new specimen to add to his museum of natural history, which occupied 3 long rooms in our house by the Lane Cove River. I was, as I have said, 8 years of age when I started with my parents on a European tour, and it was the year 1873. We stayed but a short while in England at first arrival, intending to make a longer stay on our return from the continent. We made our tour taking Italy last, and it was here that my father encountered a dangerous adventure. We were at Naples, and my father had taken an odd fancy for a picturesque-looking ruffian who had attracted his attention by a complexion unusually fair for an Italian, and in whom he professed to recognize a likeness to Tasso the poet. This man became his guide in excursions about the neighborhood of Naples, though he was not one of the regular corps of guides, and indeed seemed to have no regular occupation of a definite sort. Tasso, as my father always called him, seemed a civil fellow enough, and was fairly intelligent, but my mother disliked him extremely from the first, without being able to offer any very distinct reason for her aversion. In the event, her instinct was proved true. Tasso, his correct name, by the way, was Tommaso Marino, persuaded my father that something interesting was to be seen at the Astroni crater, 4 miles west of the city, or thereabout. Persuaded him, moreover, to make the journey on foot, and the two accordingly set out. All went well enough till the crater was reached, and then in a lonely and broken part of the hill the guide suddenly turned and attacked my father with a knife, his intention, without a doubt, being murder and the acquisition of the Englishman's valuables. Fortunately, my father had a hip pocket with a revolver in it, for he had been warned of the danger a stranger might at that time run wandering in the country about Naples. He received a wound in the flesh of his left arm in an attempt to ward off a stab, and fired at wrestling distance, with the result that his assailant fell dead on the spot. He left the place with all speed tying up his arm as he went, sought the British consul at Naples and informed him of the whole circumstances. From the authorities there was no great difficulty. An examination or two, a few signatures, some particular exertions on the part of the consul, and my father was free, so far as the officers of the law were concerned. But while these formalities were in progress, no less than 3 attempts were made on his life, 2 by the knife and 1 by shooting, and in each his escape was little short of miraculous. For the dead ruffian, Marino, had been a member of the dreaded Camorra, and the Camorristi were eager to avenge his death. To anybody acquainted with that internal history of Italy, more particularly the history of the old kingdom of Naples, the name of the Camorra will be familiar enough. It was one of the worst and most powerful of the many powerful and evil secret societies of Italy, and had none of the excuses for existence which have been from time to time put forward on behalf of the others. It was a gigantic club for the commission of crime and the extortion of money. So powerful was it that it actually imposed a regular tax on all food material entering Naples, a tax collected and paid with far more regularity than were any of the taxes due to the lawful government of the country. The carrying of smuggled goods was a monopoly of the Camorra, a perfect organization existing for the purpose throughout the kingdom. The whole population was terrorized by this detestable society, which had no less than 12 centers in the city of Naples alone. It contracted for the commission of crime just as systematically and calmly as the railway company contracts for the carriage of merchandise. A murder was so much, according to circumstances, with extras for disposing of the body. Arson was dealt in profitably. Maimings and kidnappings were carried out with promptitude and dispatch, and any diabolical outrage imaginable was a mere matter of price. One of the staple vocations of the concern was, of course, brigandage. After the coming of Victor Emmanuel and the fusion of Italy into one kingdom, the Camorra lost some of its power, but for a long time gave considerable trouble. I have heard that in the year after the matters I am describing, 200 Camorristi were banished from Italy. As soon as the legal forms were complied with, my father received the broadest possible official hint that the sooner and the more secretly he left the country, the better it would be for himself and his family. The British consul, too, impressed it upon him that the law would be entirely unable to protect him against the machinations of the Camorra. And indeed, it needed but little persuasion to induce us to leave, for my poor mother was in a state of constant terror lest we were murdered together in our hotel, so that we lost no time in returning to England and bringing our European trip to a close. In London, we stayed at a well-known private hotel near Bond Street. We had been but 3 days here when my father came in one evening with a firm conviction that he had been followed for something like 2 hours, and followed very skillfully too. More than once he had doubled suddenly with a view to confront the pursuers, who he felt were at his heels, but he had met nobody of a suspicious appearance. The next afternoon I heard my mother telling my governess, who was traveling with us, of an unpleasant-looking man who had been hanging about opposite the hotel door, and who she felt sure had afterwards been following her and my father as they were walking. My mother grew nervous and communicated her fears to my father. He, however, pooh-poohed the thing and took little thought of its meaning. Nevertheless, the dogging continued, and my father, who was never able to fix upon the persons who caused the annoyance, indeed, he rather felt their presence by instinct, as one does in such cases, than otherwise. He grew extremely angry and had some idea of consulting the police. Then, one morning, my mother discovered a little paper label stuck on the outside of the door of the bedroom occupied by herself and my father. It was a small thing, circular, and about the size of a 6-penny piece, or even smaller. but my mother was quite certain that it had not been there when she had last entered the door the night before, and she was much terrified, for the label carried a tiny device drawn awkwardly in ink. A pair of knives of curious shape crossed the sign of the Camorra. Nobody knew anything of this label, or how it came, where it had been found. My mother urged my father to place himself under the protection of the police at once, but he delayed. Indeed, I fancy he had a suspicion that the label might be the production of some practical joker staying at the hotel who had heard of his Neapolitan adventure. It was reported in many newspapers, and designed to give him a fright. But that very evening my poor father was found dead, stabbed in a dozen places in a short, quiet street not 40 yards from the hotel. He had merely gone out to buy a few cigars of a particular brand which he fancied at a shop 2 streets away, and in less than half an hour of his departure the police were at the hotel door with the news of his death, having got his address from letters in his pockets. It is no part of my present design to enlarge on my mother's grief, or to describe in detail the incidents that followed my father's death, for I am going back to this early period of my life merely to make more clear the bearings of what has recently happened to myself. It will be sufficient, therefore, to say that at the inquest the jury returned a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown, that it was several times reported that the police had obtained a most important clue, and that being so, very naturally, there was never any arrest. We returned to Sydney, and there I grew up. I should perhaps have mentioned ere this that my profession, or I should say my hobby, is that of an artist. Fortunately or unfortunately, as you may please to consider it, I have no need to follow any profession as a means of livelihood, but since I was 16 years of age, my whole time has been engrossed in drawing and painting. Were it not for my mother's invincible objection to parting with me, even for the shortest space of time, I should long ago have come to Europe to work and to study in the regular schools. As it was, I made shift to do my best in Australia and wandered about pretty freely, struggling with the difficulties of molding into artistic form the curious Australian landscape. There is an odd, desolate, uncanny note in characteristic Australian scenery, which most people are apt to regard as of little value for the purposes of the landscape painter, but with which I have always been convinced that an able painter could do great things. So I did my feeble best. 2 years ago, my mother died. My age was then 28, and I was left without a friend in the world, and so far as I know, without a relative. I soon found it impossible any longer to inhabit the large house by the Lane Cove River. It was beyond my simple needs, and the whole thing was an embarrassment, to say nothing of the associations of the house with my dead mother, which exercised a painful and depressing effect on me. So I sold the house and cut myself adrift. For a year or more, I had pursued the life of a lonely vagabond in New South Wales, painting as well as I could its scattered forests and magnificent trees, with their curious upturned foliage. Then, miserably dissatisfied with my performance, and altogether filled with a restless spirit, I determined to quit the colony and live in England, or at any rate somewhere in Europe. I would paint at the Paris schools, I promised myself, and acquire that technical mastery of my material that I now felt the lack of. The thing was no sooner resolved on than begun. I instructed my solicitors in Sydney to wind up my affairs and to communicate with their London correspondents in order that, on my arrival in England, I might deal with business matters through them. I had more than half resolved to transfer all my property to England and to make the old country my permanent headquarters, and in 3 weeks from the date of my resolve I had started. I carried with me the necessary letters of introduction to the London solicitors and the deeds appertaining to certain land in South Australia, which my father had bought just before his departure on the fatal European trip. There was workable copper in this land, It has since been ascertained, and I believed I might profitably dispose of the property to a company in London. I found myself to some extent out of my element on board a great passenger steamer. It seemed no longer possible for me, in the constant association of shipboard, to maintain that reserve which had become with me a second nature. But so much had it become my nature that I shrank ridiculously from breaking it. For grown man as I was, it must be confessed that I was absurdly shy, and indeed I fear little better than an overgrown schoolboy in my manner. But somehow I was scarce a day at sea before falling into a most pleasant acquaintance with another passenger, a man of 38 or 40, whose name was Dorrington. He was a tall, well-built fellow, rather handsome, perhaps, except for a certain extreme roundness of face and fullness of feature. He had a dark military mustache and carried himself erect, with a swing as a cavalryman, and his eyes had, I think, the most penetrating quality I ever saw. His manners were extremely engaging, and he was the only good talker I've ever met. He knew everybody, and had been everywhere. His fund of illustration and anecdote was inexhaustible, and during all my acquaintance with him I never heard him tell the same story twice. Nothing could happen, not a bird could fly by the ship, not a dish could be put on the table, but Dorrington was ready with a pungent remark and the appropriate anecdote. And he never bored nor wearied me. With all his ready talk, he never appeared unduly obtrusive, nor in the least egotistic. Mr. Horace Dorrington was altogether the most charming person I had ever met. Moreover, we discovered a community of taste in cigars. "By the way," said Dorrington to me one magnificent evening as we leaned on the rail and smoked, "Rigby isn't a very common name in Australia, is it? I seem to remember a case 20 years ago or more of an Australian gentleman of that name being very badly treated in London. Indeed, now I think of it, I'm not sure that he wasn't murdered. Ever hear anything of it?" "Yes," I said. "I heard a great deal, unfortunately. He was my father, and he was murdered." "Your father? There! I'm awfully sorry. Perhaps I shouldn't have mentioned it, but of course I didn't know." "Oh," I replied, "that's all right. It's so far back now that I don't mind speaking about it. It was a very extraordinary thing altogether." And then, feeling that I owed Dorrington a story of some sort, after listening to the many he had been telling me, I described to him the whole circumstance of my father's death. "Ah," said Dorrington, when I had finished, "I have heard of the Camorra before this. I know a thing or two about it, indeed. As a matter of fact, it still exists, not quite the widespread and open thing it once was, of course, and much smaller, but pretty active in a quiet way and pretty mischievous. They were a mighty bad lot, those Camorristi. Personally, I'm rather surprised that you heard no more of them. They were the sort of people who would rather any day murder 3 people than 1, and their usual idea of revenge went a good way beyond the mere murder of the offending party. They had a way of including his wife and family and as many relatives as possible. But at any rate, you seem to have got off right, though I'm inclined to call it rather a piece of luck than otherwise." Then, as was his invariable habit, he launched into an anecdote. He told me of the crimes of the Mafia, that Italian secret society, larger even and more powerful than the Camorra, and almost as criminal. Tales of implacable revenge visited on father, son, and grandson in succession till the race was extirpated. Then he talked of the methods, of the large funds at the disposal of the Camorra and the Mafia, and of the cunning patience with which their schemes were carried into execution, of the victims who had discovered too late that their most trusted servants were sworn to their destruction, and of those who had fled to remote parts of the earth and hoped to be lost and forgotten, but who had been shadowed and slain with barbarous ferocity in their most trusted hiding spaces. Wherever Italians were, there were apt to be a branch of one of the societies, and one could never tell where they might or might not turn up. The 2 Italian forecastle hands on board at that moment might be members and might or might not have some business in hand not included in their signed articles. I asked if he had ever come into personal contact with either of these societies or their doings. With the Camorra? No, though I know things about them that would probably surprise some of them not a little. But I have had professional dealings with the mafia, and that without coming off second best, too. But it was not so serious a case as your father's, one of a robbery of documents and blackmail. Professional dealings? I queried. Dorrington laughed. Yes, he answered. I find I've come very near to letting the cat out of the bag. I don't generally tell people who I am when I travel about, and indeed, I don't always use my own name, as I am doing now. Surely you've heard the name at some time or other. I had to confess that I did not remember it, but I excused myself by citing my secluded life and the fact that I had never left Australia since I was a child. Ah, he said, of course, we should be less heard of in Australia, but in England we're really pretty well known, my partner and I. But come now, look at me over and consider, and I'll give you a dozen guesses and bet you a sovereign you can't tell me my trade. And it's not such an uncommon or unheard of trade neither. Guessing would have been hopeless, and I said so. He did not seem the sort of man who would trouble himself about a trade at all. I gave up. Well, he said, I've no particular desire to have it known all over the ship, but I don't mind telling you. You'd find it out probably before long if you settle in the old country, that we are what is called private inquiry agents, detectives, secret service men, whatever you like to call it. Indeed. Yes, indeed. And I think I may claim that we stand as high as any, if not a trifle higher. Of course, I can't tell you, but you'd be rather astonished if you heard the names of some of our clients. We have had dealings with certain royalties, European and Asiatic, that would startle you a bit if I could tell them. Dorrington and Hicks is the name of the firm, and we are both pretty busy men, though we keep going a regiment of assistants and correspondents. I have been in Australia 3 months over a rather awkward and complicated matter, but I fancy I've pulled it through pretty well, and I mean to reward myself with a little holiday when I get back. There now, you know the worst of me, and D and H present their respectful compliments and trust that by unfailing punctuality and a strict attention to business they may hope to receive your esteemed commands whenever you may be so unfortunate as to require their services. Family secrets extracted, cleaned, scaled, or stopped with gold. Special attention given to wholesale orders. He laughed and pulled out his cigar case. You haven't another cigar in your pocket, he said, or you wouldn't smoke that stump so low. Try one of these. I took the cigar and lit it at my remainder. Ah, then, I said, I take it that it is the practice of your profession that has given you such a command of curious and out-of-the-way information and anecdote. Plainly, you must have been in the midst of many curious affairs. Yes, I believe you, Dorrington replied, but as it happens, the most curious of my experiences I am unable to relate, since they are matters of professional confidence. Such as I can tell, I usually tell with altered names, dates, and places. One learns discretion in such a trade as mine. As to your adventure with the mafia now, is there any secrecy about that? Dorrington shrugged his shoulders. No, he said. None in particular. But the case was not particularly interesting. It was in Florence. The documents were the property of a wealthy American, and some of the mafia rascals managed to steal them. It doesn't matter what the documents were. That's a private matter. But their owner would have parted with a great deal to get them back, and the mafia held them for ransom. But they had such a fearful notion of the American's wealth and of what he ought to pay, that badly as he wanted his papers back, he couldn't stand their demands, and employed us to negotiate and do our best for him. I think I might have managed to get the things stolen back again. Indeed, I spent some time thinking a plan over, but I decided in the end that it wouldn't pay. If the mafia were tricked in any way, they might consider it appropriate to stick somebody with a knife, and that was not an easy thing to provide against. So I took a little time and went another way to work. The details don't matter. They're quite uninteresting, and to tell you them would be to talk mere professional shop. There's a great deal of dull and patient work to be done in my business. Anyhow, I contrived to find out exactly in whose hands the documents lay. He wasn't altogether a blameless creature, and there were 2 or 3 little things that, properly handled, might have brought him into awkward complications with the law. So I delayed the negotiations while I got my nets effectually round this gentleman, who was the president of that particular branch of the mafia. And when all was ready, I had a friendly interview with him and just showed him my hand of cards. They served as no other argument would have done. And in the end, we concluded quite an amicable arrangement on easy terms for both parties. And my client got his property back, including all expenses, at about 1/5 of the price he expected to have to pay. That's all. I learned a deal about the mafia while the business lasted, and at that and other times I learned a good deal about the Camorra too. Dorrington and I grew more intimate every day of the voyage, till he knew every detail of my uneventful little history, and I knew many of his own most curious experiences. In truth, he was a man with an irresistible fascination for a dull home bird like myself. With all his gaiety, he never forgot business, and at most of our stopping places he sent off messages by cable to his partner. As the voyage drew near its end, he grew anxious and impatient lest he should not arrive in time to enable him to get to Scotland for the grouse shooting on the 12th of August. His one amusement, it seemed, was shooting, and the holiday he had promised himself was to be spent on a grouse moor which he rented in Perthshire. It would be a great nuisance to miss the 12th, he said, but it would apparently be a near shave. He thought, however, in that case he might be done by leaving the ship at Plymouth and rushing up to London by the first train. Yes, he said, I think I shall be able to do it in that way, even if the boat is a couple of days late. By the way, he added suddenly, why not come to Scotland with me? You haven't any particular business in hand, and I can promise you a week or 2 of good fun. The invitation pleased me. It's very good of you, I said, and as a matter of fact, I haven't any very urgent business in London. I must see those solicitors I told you of, but that's not a matter of hurry. Indeed, an hour or 2 on my way through London would be enough. But as I don't know any of your party, and— Poh, my dear fellow, answered Dorrington with a snap of his fingers. That's all right. I shan't have a party. There won't be time to get it together. 1 or 2 might come down a little later, but if they do, they'll be capital fellows, delighted to make your acquaintance, I'm sure. Indeed, you'll do me a great favor if you'll come, else I shall be all alone without a soul to say a word to. Anyway, I won't miss the 12th, and if it's to be done by any possibility, you'll have to come, you know. You've no excuse. I can lend you the guns and anything you want, though I believe you've such things with you. Who is your London solicitor, by the way? Mowbray of Lincoln's Inn Fields. Oh, Mowbray? We know him well. His partner died last year. When I say we know him well, I mean as a firm. I have never met him personally, though my partner, who does the office work, has regular dealings with him. He's an excellent man, but his managing clerk's frightful. I wonder Mowbray keeps him. Don't you let him do anything for you on his own hook. He makes the most disastrous messes, or I rather fancy he drinks. Deal with Mowbray himself. There's nobody better in London. And, by the way, now that I think of it, it's lucky you've nothing urgent for him, for he's sure to be off out of town for the 12th. He's a rare old gunner and never misses a season. So that now you haven't a shade of an excuse for leaving me in the lurch, and we'll consider the thing settled. Settled accordingly it was, and the voyage ended uneventfully. But the steamer was late, and we left it at Plymouth and rushed up to town on the 10th. We had 3 or 4 hours to prepare before leaving Euston by the night train. Dorrington's moor was a long drive from Crieff station, and he calculated that at best we could not arrive there before the early evening of the following day, which would, however, give us a comfortable time for a good long night's rest before the morning's sport opened. Fortunately, I had plenty of loose cash with me, so that there was nothing to delay us in that regard. We made ready in Dorrington's rooms. He was a bachelor in Conduit Street and got off comfortably by the 10 o'clock train from Euston. Then followed a most delightful 8 days. The weather was fine, the birds were plentiful, and my first taste of grouse shooting was a complete success. I resolved in the future to come out of my shell and mix in a world that contains such charming fellows as Dorrington and such delightful sports as that I was then enjoying. But on the 8th day Dorrington received a telegram calling him instantly to London. "It's a shocking nuisance," he said. "Here's my holiday either knocked on the head altogether or cut in two, and I fear it's the first rather than the second. It's just the way in such an uncertain profession as mine. There's no possible help for it, however. I must go, as you'd understand, at once if you knew the case. But what chiefly annoys me is leaving you all alone." I reassured him on this point, and pointed out that I had for a long time been used to a good deal of my own company, though indeed, with Dorrington away, life at the shooting lodge threatened to be less pleasant than it had been. "But you'll be bored to death here," Dorrington said, his thoughts jumping with my own. "But on the other hand, it won't be much good going up to town yet. Everybody's out of town, and Mowbray among them. There's a little business of ours that's waiting for him at this moment. My partner mentioned it in his letter yesterday. Why not put in the time with a little tour around? Or you might work up to London by irregular stages and look about you. As an artist, you'd like to see a few of the old towns, probably, Edinburgh, Chester, Warwick, and so on. It isn't a great program, perhaps, but I hardly know what else to suggest. As for myself, I must be off as I am by the first train I can get." I begged him not to trouble about me, but to attend to his business. As a matter of fact, I was disposed to get to London and take chambers, at any rate for a little while. But Chester was a place I much wanted to see, a real old town with walls round it, and I was not indisposed to take a day at Warwick. So in the end I resolved to pack up and make for Chester the following day, and from there to take a train for Warwick, and in half an hour Dorrington was gone. Chester was all delight to me. My recollections of the trip to Europe in my childhood were vivid enough as to the misfortunes that followed my father. But of the ancient buildings we visited, I remembered little. Now in Chester I found that medieval town I had often read of. I wandered for hours together in the quaint old rows and walked on the city wall. The evening after my arrival was fine and moonlight, and I was tempted from my hotel. I took a stroll about the town and finished by a walk along the wall from the Watergate toward the cathedral. The moon flecked over now and again by scraps of cloud, and at times obscured for half a minute altogether, lighted up all the Rue D in the intervals, and touched with silver the river beyond. But as I walked, presently grew aware of a quiet shuffling footstep some little way behind me. I took little heed of it at first, though I could see nobody near me from whom the sound might come. But soon I perceived that when I stopped, as I did from time to gaze over the parapet, the mysterious footsteps stopped also, and when I resumed my walk, the quiet shuffling treads began again. At first I thought it might be an echo, but a moment's reflection dispelled that idea. Mine was an even distinct walk, and this which followed was a soft, quick shuffling step, a mere scuffle. Moreover, when by way of test I took a few silent steps on tiptoe, the shuffle still persisted. I was being followed. Now, I do not know whether or not it may sound like a childish fancy, but I confess I thought of my father. When last I had been in England as a child, my father's violent death had been preceded by just the followings. And now, after all these years, on my return, on the very first night I walked abroad alone, there were strange footsteps in my track. The walk was narrow, and nobody could possibly pass me unseen. I turned suddenly, therefore, and hastened back. At once I saw a dark figure rise from the shadow of the parapet and run. I ran too, but I could not gain on the figure, which receded farther and more indistinctly before me. One reason was that I felt doubtful of my footing on the unfamiliar track. I ceased my chase and continued my stroll. It might easily have been some vagrant thief, I thought, who had a notion to rush at a convenient opportunity and snatch my watch. But here I was, far past the spot where I had turned. There was the shuffling footstep behind me again. For a little while I feigned not to notice it, then swinging round as swiftly as I could, I made a quick rush. Useless again, for there in the distance scuttled that same indistinct figure more rapidly than I could run. What did it mean? I liked the affair so little that I left the walls and walked toward my hotel. The streets were quiet. I had traversed two, and was about emerging into one of the two main streets where the rows are, when from the farther part of the dark street behind me there came once more the sound of the now unmistakable footstep. I stopped. The footsteps stopped also. I turned and walked back a few steps, and as I did, the sounds went scuffling away at the far end of the street. It could not be fancy. It could not be chance. For a single incident, perhaps, such an explanation might serve, but not for this persistent recurrence. I hurried away to my hotel, resolved, since I could not come at my pursuer, to turn back no more. But before I reached the hotel, there were the shuffling footsteps again, and not far behind. It would not be true to say that I was alarmed at this stage of the adventure, but I was troubled to know what it all might mean, and altogether puzzled to account for it. I thought a great deal, but I went to bed and rose in the morning no wiser than ever. Whether or not it was a mere fancy induced by the last night's experience, I cannot say. But I went about that day with a haunting feeling that I was watched. And to me, the impression was very real indeed. I listened often, but in the bustle of the day, even in quiet old Chester, the individual characters of different footsteps were not easily recognizable. Once, however, as I descended a flight of steps from the rows, I fancied I heard a quick shuffle in the curious old gallery I had just quitted. I turned up the steps again and looked. There was a shabby sort of man looking in one of the windows and leaning so far as to hide his head behind the heavy oaken pilaster that supported the building above. It might have been his footsteps, or it might have been my fancy. At any rate, I would have a look at him. I mounted the top stair, but as I turned in his direction, the man ran off, with his face averted and his head ducked, and vanished down another stair. I made all speed after him, but when I reached the street, he was nowhere to be seen. What could it all mean? The man was rather above the middle height, and he wore one of those soft felt hats similar to the head of the London organ grinder. Also, his hair was black and bushy and protruded all over the back of his coat collar. Surely this was no delusion. Surely I was not imagining an Italian aspect for this man simply because of the recollection of my father's death. Perhaps I was foolish, but I took no pleasure in Chester. The embarrassment was a novel one for me, and I could not forget it. I went back to my hotel, paid my bill, sent my bag to the railway station, and took train for Warwick by way of Crewe. It was dark when I arrived, but the night was near as fine as last night had been at Chester. I took a very little late dinner at my hotel and fell into doubt what to do with myself. One rather fat and very sleepy commercial traveler was the only other customer visible, and the billiard room was empty. There seemed to be nothing to do but to light a cigar and take a walk. I could just see enough of the old town to give me good hopes of tomorrow's sightseeing. There was nothing visible of quite such as an interesting character as one might meet in Chester, but there were a few good fine old 16th century houses, and there were the two gates with the chapels above them. But of course the castle was the great showpiece, and that I should visit on the morrow, if there were no difficulties as to permission. There were some very fine pictures there, if I remembered aright what I had read. I was walking down the incline from one of the gates, trying to remember who the painters of those pictures were besides Van Dyck and Holbein, when that shuffling step was behind me again. I admit that it cost me an effort this time to turn on my pursuer. There was something uncanny in the persistent, elusive footstep. And indeed, there was something alarming in my circumstances, dogged thus from place to place and unable to shake off my enemy, or to understand his movements or his motive. Turn I did, however, and straightway the shuffling step went off at a hastened pace in the shadow of the gate. This time I made no more than half a dozen steps back. I turned again and pushed my way to the hotel. And as I went, the shuffling step came after. The thing was serious. There must be some object in this unceasing watching, and the object could bode no good to me. Plainly, some unseen eye had been on me the whole of that day, and noted my goings and comings and my journey from Chester. Again, and irresistibly, the watchings that preceded my father's death came to mind, and I could not forget them. I could have no doubt now that I had been closely watched from the moment I had set foot in Plymouth. But who could have been waiting to watch me at Plymouth, when indeed I had only decided to land at the last moment? Then I thought of the two Italian forecastle hands on the steamer, the very men whom Dorrington had used to illustrate in what unexpected quarters members of that terrible Italian secret societies might be found. And the Camorra was not satisfied with single revenge. It destroyed the son after the father, and it waited for many years with infinite patience and cunning. Dogged by the steps, I reached the hotel and went to bed. I slept but fitfully at first, though better rest came as the night wore on. In the early morning I woke with a sudden shock and with an indefinite sense of being disturbed by somebody about me. The window was directly opposite the foot of the bed, and there, as I looked, was the face of a man, dark, evil, and grinning, with a bush of black hair about his uncovered head and small rings in his ears. There was but a flash, and the face vanished. I was struck by the terror that one so often feels on a sudden and violent awakening from sleep, and it was some seconds ere I could leave my bed and get to the window. My room was on the first floor, and the window looked down on a stable yard. I had a momentary glimpse of a human figure leaving the gate of the yard, and it was the figure that had fled before me in the rows at Chester. A ladder belonging to the yard stood under the window, and that was all. I rose and dressed. I could stand this sort of thing no longer. If it were only something tangible, if there were only somebody I could take hold of and fight with if necessary, it would not have been so bad. But I was surrounded by some mysterious machination, persistent, unexplainable, and it was altogether impossible to tackle or to face. To complain to the police would have been absurd. They would take me for a lunatic. They are indeed just such complaints that lunatics so often make to the police, complaints of being followed by indefinite enemies, and of being besieged by faces that look in at windows. Even if they did not set me down a lunatic, what could the police of a provincial town do for me in a case like this? No, I must go and consult Dorrington. I had my breakfast, and then I decided that I would at any rate try the castle before leaving. Try it I did accordingly, and was allowed to go over it. But through the whole morning I was oppressed by the horrible sense of being watched by malignant eyes. Clearly there was no comfort for me while this lasted, and so after lunch I caught a train which brought me to Euston soon after 6:30. I took a cab straight to Dorrington's rooms, but he was out, and was not expected home till late. So I drove to a large hotel near Charing Cross. I avoid mentioning its name for reasons which will presently be understood. Sent in my bag, and dined. I had not the smallest doubt but that I was still under the observation of the man or the men who had so far pursued me. I had indeed no doubt of eluding them, except by the contrivance of Dorrington's expert brain. So, as I had no desire to hear that shuffling footstep again, indeed, it had seemed at Warwick to have a physically painful effect on my nerves, I stayed within and got to bed early. I had no fear of waking face to face with a grinning Italian here. My window was 4 floors up, out of reach of anything but a fire escape. And in fact, I woke comfortably and naturally, and saw nothing from my window but the bright sky, the buildings opposite, and the traffic below. But as I turned to close my door behind me, as I emerged into the corridor, there on the muntin of the frame, just below the bedroom number, was a little round paper label, perhaps a trifle smaller than a sixpence, and on the label, drawn awkwardly in ink, was a device of two crossed knives of curious crooked shape, the sign of the Camorra. I will not attempt to describe the effect of this sign upon me. It may best be imagined in view of what I have said of the incidents preceding the murder of my father. It was the sign of an inexorable fate creeping nearer step by step, implacable, inevitable, and mysterious. In little more than 12 hours after seeing that sign, my father had been a mangled corpse. One of the hotel servants passed as I stood by the door, and I made shift to ask him if he knew anything of the label. He looked at the paper and then more curiously at me, but he could offer no explanation. I spent little time over breakfast and then went by cab to Conduit Street. I paid my bill and took my bag with me. Dorrington had gone to his office, but he had left a message that if I called, I was to follow him, and the office was in Bedford Street, Covent Garden. I turned the cab in that direction forthwith. "Why," said Dorrington as we shook hands, "I believe you look a bit out of sorts. Doesn't England agree with you?" "Well," I answered, "it has proved rather trying so far," and then I described in exact detail my adventures as I have set them down here. Dorrington looked grave. "It's really extraordinary," he said, "most extraordinary. And it isn't often that I call a thing extraordinary either with my experience. But it's plain something must be done, something to gain some time at any rate. We're in the dark at present, of course, and I expect I shall have to fish about a little before I get at anything to go on. In the meantime, I think you must disappear as artfully as we can manage." He sat silent for a little while, thoughtfully tapping his forehead with his fingertips. "I wonder," he said presently, "whether or not those Italian fellows on the steamer are in it or not. I suppose you haven't made yourself known anywhere, have you?" "Nowhere. As you know, you've been with me all the time till you left the moor, and since then I have been with nobody and called on nobody. Now, there's no doubt it's the Camorra," Dorrington said. "That's pretty plain. I think I told you on the steamer that it was rather wonderful that you had heard nothing of them after your father's death. What has caused them all this delay, there's no telling. They know best themselves. It's been lucky for you, anyway, so far. What I'd like to find out now is how they have identified you and got on your track so promptly. There's no guessing where these fellows get their information. It's just wonderful. But if we can find out, then perhaps we can stop the supply or turn on something that will lead them into a pit. If you had called anywhere on business and declared yourself, as you might have done, for instance, at Mowbray's, I might be inclined to suspect that they got the tip in some crooked way from there. But you haven't. Of course, if those Italian chaps on the steamer are in it, you're probably identified pretty certainly. But if they're not, they may only have made a guess. We two landed together and kept together till a day or two ago, as far as any outsider would know. I might be Rigby and you might be Dorrington. Come, we'll work on those lines. I think I smell a plan. Are you staying anywhere?" "No, I paid my bill at the hotel and came along here with my bag." "Very well. Now, there's a house at Highgate kept by a very trustworthy man whom I know very well, where a man might be pretty comfortable for a few days or even for a week, if he doesn't mind staying indoors and keeping himself out of sight. I expect your friends at the Camorra are watching in the street outside at this moment, but I think it will be fairly easy to get you away to Highgate without letting them into the secret. If you don't mind secluding yourself for a bit, in the circumstances, I take it you won't object at all?" "Object? I should think not." "Very well, that's settled. You can call yourself Dorrington or not, as you please, though perhaps it will be safest not to shout Rigby too loud. But as for myself, for a day or two at least, I'm going to be Mr. James Rigby. Have you your card case handy?" Yes, here it is. But then, as to taking my name, won't you run a serious risk? Dorrington winked merrily. I've run a risk or two before now, he said, in course of my business, and if I don't mind the risk, you needn't grumble, for I warn you I shall charge for risk when I send you my bill, and I think I can take care of myself fairly well, even with the Camorra about. I shall take you to this place at Highgate, and then you won't see me for a few days. It won't do for me, in the character of Mr. James Rigby, to go dragging a trail up and down between this place and your retreat. You've got some other identifying papers, haven't you? Yes, I have. I produced the letter from my Sydney lawyers to Mowbray and the deeds of the South Australian property from my bag. Ah, said Dorrington, I'll give you a formal receipt for these, since they're valuable. It's a matter of business, and we'll do it in a business-like way. I may want something solid like this to support any bluff I may have to make. A mere case of cards won't always act, you know. It's a pity old Mowbray's out of town, for there's a way in which he might give a little help, I fancy. But never mind. Leave it all to me. There's your receipt. Keep it snug away somewhere where inquisitive people can't read it. He handed me the receipt and then took me to his partner's room and introduced me. Mr. Hicks was a small, wrinkled man, older than Dorrington, I should think, by 15 or 20 years, and with all the aspect and manner of a quiet old professional man. Dorrington left the room and presently returned with his hat in his hand. Yes, he said, there's a charming dark gentleman with a head like a mop and rings in his ears skulking about at the next corner. If it was he who looked in at your window, I don't wonder you were startled. His dress suggests the organ-grinding interest, but he looks as though cutting a throat would be more in his line than grinding a tune, and no doubt he has friends as engaging as himself close at call. If you'll come with me now, I think we shall give him the slip. I have a growler ready for you. A hansom's a bit too glassy and public. Pull down the blinds and sit back when you get inside. He led me to a yard at the back of the building wherein the office stood, from which a short flight of steps led to the basement. We followed a passage in this basement until we reached another flight, and, ascending these, we emerged into the corridor of another building. Out at the door at the end of this, and we passed a large block of model dwellings, and were in Bedfordbury. Here a four-wheeler was waiting, and I shut myself in it without delay. I was to proceed as far as King's Cross in this cab. Dorrington had arranged, and there he would overtake me in a swift hansom. It felt out as he had settled, and dismissing the hansom, he came the rest of the journey with me in the four-wheeler. We stopped at length before one of the row of houses, apparently recently built, houses of the over-ornamented, gabled, and tiled sort that abound in the suburbs. Crufting is the man's name, Dorrington said as we alighted. He's rather an odd sort of customer, but quite decent in the main, and his wife makes coffee such as money won't buy in most places. A woman answered Dorrington's ring, a woman of most extreme thinness. Dorrington greeted her as Mrs. Crufting, and we entered. We've just lost our servant again, Mr. Dorrington, the woman said in a shrill voice, and Mr. Crufting ain't at home, but I'm expecting him before long. I don't think I need wait to see him, Mrs. Crufting, Dorrington answered. I'm sure I can leave my friend in better hands than yours. I hope you've a vacant room. Well, for a friend of yours, Mr. Dorrington, no doubt we can find room. That's right. My friend, Mr. Dorrington gave me a meaning look. Mr. Phelps would like to stay here for a few days. He wants to be quite quiet for a little. Do you understand? Oh, yes, Mr. Dorrington, I understand. Very well, then. Make him as comfortable as you can and give him some sort of your best coffee. I believe you've got quite a little library of books, and Mr. Phelps will be glad of them. Have you got any cigars? Dorrington added, turning to me. Yes, there are some in my bag. Then I think you'll be pretty comfortable now. Goodbye. I expect you'll see me in a few days, or at any rate, you'll get a message. Meantime, be as happy as you can. Dorrington left, and the woman showed me to a room upstairs where I placed my bag. In front, on the same floor, was a sitting room with, I suppose, some 200 or 300 books, mostly novels, on shelves. The furniture of the place was of the sort one expects to find in an ordinary lodging-house: horsehair sofas, loo tables. Leicester's, and so forth. Mrs. Crofting explained to me that the customary dinner hour was 2, but that I might dine when I liked. I elected, however, to follow the custom of the house, and sat down to a cigar and a book. At 2 o'clock the dinner came, and I was agreeably surprised to find it a very good one, much above what the appointments of the house had led me to expect. Plainly, Mrs. Crofting was a capital cook. There was no soup, but there was a very excellent sole, and some well-done cutlets with peas, and an omelette, also a bottle of Bass. Come, I felt that I should not do so badly in this place after all. I trusted that Dorrington would be as comfortable in his half of the transaction, bearing my responsibilities and troubles. I had heard a heavy blundering tread on the floor below, and judged from this that Mr. Crofting had returned. After dinner I lit a cigar, and Mrs. Crofting brought her coffee. Truly, it was excellent coffee, and brewed as I liked it, strong and black, and plenty of it. It had a flavor of its own, too, novel, but not unpleasing. I took 1 cupful and brought another to my side as I lay on the sofa with my book. I had not read 6 lines before I was asleep. I awoke with a sensation of numbing cold in my right side, a terrible stiffness in my limbs, and a sound of loud splashing in my ears. All was pitch dark, and what was this? Water! Water all about me! I was lying in 6 inches of cold water, and more was pouring down upon me from above. My head was afflicted with a splitting ache, but where was I? Why was it dark, and whence all the water? I staggered to my feet and instantly struck my head against a hard roof above me. I raised my hand, and there was the roof, or whatever place it was, hard, smooth, and cold, and little more than 5 feet from the floor, so that I was bent as I stood. I spread my hand to the side that was hard, smooth, and cold too, and then the conviction struck me like a blow. I was in a covered iron tank, and the water was pouring in to drown me. I dashed my hands frantically against the lid and strove to raise it. It would not move. I shouted at the top of my voice and turned about to feel the extent of my prison. One way I could touch the opposite sides at once easily with my hands, and the other way it was wider, perhaps a little more than 6 feet altogether. What was this? Was this to be my fearful end, cooped in this tank while the water rose by inches to choke me? Already the water was a foot deep. I flung myself at the side. I beat the pitiless iron with fists, face, and head. I screamed and implored. Then it struck me that I might at least stop the inlet of water. I put out my hand and felt the falling stream, then found the inlet and stopped it with my fingers. But water still poured in with a resounding splash. There was another opening at the opposite end, which I could not reach without releasing the one I now held. I was but prolonging my agony. Oh, the devilish cunning that had devised these 2 inlets so far apart! Again I beat the sides, broke my nails with tearing at the corners, screamed and entreated in my agony. I was mad, but with no dulling of the senses, for the horrors of my awful, helpless state overwhelmed my brain, keen and perceptive to every ripple of the unceasing water. In the height of my frenzy, I held my breath, for I heard a sound from outside. I shouted again, implored some quicker death. Then there was a scraping on the lid above me, and it was raised at one edge and let in the light of a candle. I sprang from my knees and forced the lid back, and the candle flame danced before me. The candle was held by a dusty man, a workman apparently, who stared at me with scared eyes and said nothing but, "Couleur!" Overhead were the rafters of a gabled roof, and tilted against them was the thick beam which, jammed across from one sloping rafter to another, had held the tank lid fast. "Help me!" I gasped. "Help me out!" The man took me by the armpits and hauled me, dripping and half dead, over the edge of the tank into which the water still poured. making a noise into the hollow iron that half drowned our voices. The man had been at work on the cistern of a neighboring house, and hearing an uncommon noise, he had climbed through the spaces left in the party walls to give passage along under the roofs to the builders' men. Among the joists at our feet was the trap-door through which, drugged and insensible, I had been carried to be flung into that horrible cistern. With the help of my friend, the workman, I made shift to climb through by the way he had come. We got back to the house where he had been at work, and there the people gave me brandy and lent me dry clothes. I made haste to send for the police, but when they arrived, Mrs. Crafting and her respectable spouse had gone. Some unusual noise in the roof must have warned them, and when the police, following my directions further, got to the offices of Dorrington and Hicks, those acute professional men had gone too, but in such haste that the contents of the office papers and everything else had been left just as they stood. The plot was clear now. The followings, the footsteps, the face at the window, the label on the door, all were a mere humbug, arranged by Dorrington for his own purpose, which was to drive me into his power and get my papers from me. Armed with these, and with his consummate address and knowledge of affairs, he could go to Mr. Mowbray in the character of Mr. James Rigby, sell my land in South Australia, and have the whole of my property transferred to himself from Sydney. The rest of my baggage was in his rooms. If any further proof were required, it might be found there. He had taken good care that I should not meet Mr. Mowbray, who, by the way, I afterwards found had not left his office and had never fired a gun in his life. At first I wondered that Dorrington had not made some murderous attempt on me at the shooting place in Scotland, but a little thought convinced me that that would have been bad policy for him. The disposal of the body would be difficult, and he would have to account somehow for my sudden disappearance, whereas by the use of his Italian assistant in his murder apparatus at Highgate, I was made to efface my own trail and could be got rid of in the end with little trouble. For my body, stripped of everything that might identify me, would be simply that of a drowned man, unknown, whom nobody could identify. The whole plot was contrived upon the information I myself had afforded Dorrington during the voyage home, and it all sprang from his remembering the report of my father's death. When the papers in the office came to be examined, there each step in the operations was plainly revealed. There was a code telegram from Suez directing Hicks to hire a grouse moor. There were telegrams and letters from Scotland giving directions as to the latter movements. Indeed, the thing was displayed completely. The business of Dorrington and Hicks had really been that of private inquiry agents, and they had done much bona fide business, but many of their operations had been of a more than questionable sort, and among their papers were found complete sets, neatly arranged in dockets, each containing in skeleton a complete history of the case. Many of these cases were of a most interesting character, and I have been enabled to piece together out of the material thus supplied the narratives which will follow this. As to my own case, it only remains to say that as yet neither Dorrington, Hicks, nor the Croftings have been caught. They played in the end for a high stake. They might have made 6 figures of me if they had killed me, and the first figure could not have been a 1. And they lost by a mere accident. But I have often wondered how many of the bodies which the coroner's juries of London have returned to be found drowned were drowned, not where they were picked up, but in that horrible tank at Highgate. What the drug was that gave Mrs. Crofting's coffee its value in Dorrington's eyes, I do not know, but plainly it had not been sufficient in my case to keep me unconscious against the shock of cold water till I should be drowned altogether. Months have passed since my adventure, but even now I sweat at the sight of an iron tank. The end.